Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Next group tonight in person and online. So, our online friends. First off, I just wanted to let you know about a few other upcoming events we have, so you can come back soon. The next one is a poetry workshop on Saturday, November 19th from 10 to 12. It's called Imagining Reality. Is it a lie to fictionalize reality for the sake of art? That's a poetry writing workshop with Eva Boatman. On Wednesday, November 30th at 7, we have Frederick Law Olmsted and his legacy on the North Shore. And that will be presented by landscape historian Pamela Hartford. And we're announcing tonight on Friday, December 9th at the Lorcom Theater in Beverly. We're offering an exclusive opportunity for members to receive discounted tickets to a special musical performance by the international touring group Radio World Music, with special guest Maret Nesbitt, who is an Irish violinist, who is a member of the renowned group Celtic Woman, and one of the original two fiddlers in Michael Flatley's Lord of the Dance in the 1990s. So you don't want to miss that. Ticket information will be on our website soon, but I can tell you we only have 30 tickets, and there'll be a special rate just for Academy members. Good seats, not good rate. So for tonight's program, and anyone who's not a member, you may join and hit us up for that special night. Membership is open to everyone. If you have questions, you can ask Kristen and we're at the check-in desk for me later on. And for tonight's program, I'm going to invite Bill Lundergan to come up. He's our trustee and treasurer of the Athenaeum, and he's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jean Marie. Nothing happens at the Athenaeum without Jean Marie. Good evening. Before I start, I'd like to introduce a few people. Bob's spouse, Jean Shinto, is here. And friends of his, Pat Keck, Mike Arthur, sitting next to me, and their friend Linda Meltz. I'd like to take a moment and tell you a little bit about Bob's background. I met Bob many years ago when he was an exhibitor at the Peabody Museum, where they had their antique show the weekend after Thanksgiving. And I have bought clocks from Bob. He's repaired clocks for me. And he has quite a background. Bob has professionally repaired nearly 8,000 timepieces and has sold more than 1,700 vintage clocks and watches. A Silver Star Fellow, one of NAWCC's highest honors of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. He is chairman of its Time Symposium Committee. He organized groundbreaking horology-related conference at the Winfrey Museum, Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Henry Ford Museum, Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and assisted in creating the 2019 Time Made in Germany International Symposium in Nuremberg. As a scholar of horology, assisted by a personal library of over 800 books on the subject, he has published more than 100 articles and reviews. For more than 5 years, he wrote detailed catalog descriptions for thousands of antique clocks and watches. He's a livery man with the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers in London, a proprietor of the Boston Athenaeum, and soon to be a member of the Salem Athenaeum, I hope.
Share number one.
Exhibit curator for the Horological Society. After graduating from George Washington University in 1973, he worked for 10 years on Capitol Hill in Washington as a speechwriter, legislative assistant, and press secretary for Congressman John Canoides of Detroit, and then for Congressman Shirley Chisholm of Brooklyn. The next 10 years, he ran ACO, a Lawrence, Massachusetts acrylic furniture manufacturing company. Bob has been on the Andover, the Lawrence City Planning Board, trustee of the White Funding, the local charitable foundation, and a trustee of the Lawrence Public Library. Welcome to the Salem Athenaeum Board.
Thank you, Bill. I have
fond memories of you too, when you bought all those clocks for me. Let me break them again when they stopped working. I love hearing introductions because I keep thinking, I want to be that guy. How does he get to stand up there? And he, wait a minute, I actually am that guy. It feels good. I don't know how it happened, except I just kind of kept at it. And I suppose that's the way it's supposed to happen. You work at something long enough and eventually it becomes real. So I'm glad it became real. But yeah, I'm happy to be here too. You know, my time with the Boston Athenaeum has been wonderful. And I think we're not joking about how I should become a part of this place too, at least as a member, because even though Salem isn't close enough to Andover, you need to move the town a little closer because you can't get there from here, you know. But it's but when I get here, I enjoy it. So thank you. So one of my sort of favorite talks I talked about is sort of how timekeeping and timekeepers developed in New England, but I always try to give it sort of a local cut if I can. So you're going to learn something about sort of the broader picture of the development of how we knew what time it was and why we cared about it. But there'll be some Salem specific information here too that I think will be fun, including the wax paper that you see in my opening image there. And we'll talk more about what these are and who this guy was. But it's fun to have actual physical things from those periods of time too. My business is Bell Time Clocks. Some 30 some years ago, when I was trying to think of the name for my clock repair business that I was starting, I had just purchased this Harper's Weekly engraving by Winslow Homer called Bell Time, and it's a view of the mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where I was living at the time. So it sort of dawned on me that Bell Time Clock should be the name of the business. And it's there's no bell, there's no clock in this one, but you see a tower there that had a bell in it. And this Winslow Homer engraving illustration accompanied an article that spoke about how already at this time, and certainly in mill towns, people were living and breathing and working by the bell, by the clock. In Lawrence, for example, there were 3 bells when the mills were beginning their daytime shift. And if you weren't there by the 3rd bell, the gate had shut and you lost the day's work. So these people were rushing back and forth to work in those mills along the Merrimack River, which you can see there as well. The question I often ask, even though of course I know the answer, is how many clocks and watches were on the Mayflower? And the answer is 0, because portable timekeeping really didn't exist in the way that was accurate enough. So when they got on this boat, they didn't bring clocks and watches with them. They didn't have them. They were too expensive. There was no point in having them. And they told time in other ways, including by sandglasses. And these were carried on most ships. Mostly they were half-hour duration, so that the helmsman would have this. He was steering the ship, and he would turn it over when all the sand was gone. However, if it was cold, rainy, and no one was looking, he turned it over a little bit early so he could go back to bed. And that was called eating sand. And eventually, if he did that often enough, he would reverse day and night on the ship. So it wasn't a good thing, but especially if it was foggy or bad weather and they couldn't regain the right time by sighting the sun, that happened periodically. But also on these ships, and the bells would ring. Some of you maybe have a Chelsea clock that rings ship bells, or you were in the Navy perhaps. So there's a period from 1 to 8 every 4 hours when the bells ring. This is again Winslow Homer that some of you may recognize. Where the guy is announcing whatever the time is on the ship. The mechanical timekeeping, things that actually tick, started we think in the 13th century. It was mostly related with monasteries and churches, monasteries particularly perhaps in the northern Italy, southern Germany, where there were religious orders that required frequent and regular prayer sessions even during the night. So before they had a candle that might burn down with lines on it, and some poor monk was waiting up looking for the line, and then he'd ring the bell. Monks would have to get up and pray, and so they could get back to bed soon. So it was, or else they were sandglasses, or else water clocks, perhaps, but ticking timepieces. They were already geared machines, but something that ticked that actually could tell time was developed around that time. The word clock derives from the Latin for bell, because originally they just rang the bell, there was no face. But then they were started to be in churches. The oldest known tower clock was in Salisbury Cathedral that you're seeing here. And there's the giant, the big iron machine, which no longer keeps time in the tower, but they still have, and this is the oldest known clock movement in Western Europe anyway, that would keep the time. And there weren't clockmakers back then. These were made by itinerant guys who could make them, or they were blacksmiths or metalworkers of some sort. Not particularly reliable, but it was an important thing for early cities to have. And eventually every town and city wanted to have a tower clock, an important town clock, to also kind of help regulate society. So we're seeing this tower at Westminster on the opening day in 1859, I should say. Let's see, I know because this is being recorded and everyone will call me up if I get it wrong. 1859 was the first day when this started to strike. And I'm sure you're all saying, hey, that's Big Ben. But no, this is Big Ben. Big Ben is the bell that's in the tower. It's not officially the name of the tower or the clock. It's the bell, and it was named after the founder of the bell, and it rang the hour note. And you see the other bells up there, which would ring the Westminster chime that we're all familiar with from our doorbells and chiming clocks that would ring the other notes every quarter hour. But as we start to see the development of towns like Salem that we're seeing from, I believe this is the Alvin Fisher painting of a view of Salem. 1818 from Gallow Hill. I think I've never been to Gallow Hill. Maybe I don't want to go there. But so this is good. So we're already starting to see church towers, and at least one of them, if not more of them, there was a clock. You started to get to the problem where if there was more than one, they would be dueling ones, so they weren't always striking at the same time. So you had to say if you were going to meet, your friend for lunch, it might be I'll meet at noon by, St. Ignatius bell, instead of some other churches if you ended up with too many of them in the town. So this is an illustration of Salem's first meeting house, and obviously there was a clock in it too. I just found this image recently when I was looking for Salem-related things. And this, interestingly enough, has a diamond-shaped dial, which was uncommon. Mostly they were round or square, but it's interesting because there's another clock that also has a diamond dial. This is the famous Paul Revere engraving of the Boston Massacre, and you see on the old brick church back there, there's a diamond dial in addition to a building-mounted sundial. And I'll show you the detail of that in a minute. But I also want to make the point that and some of you may know that this was a propaganda piece. The Boston Massacre did not happen like Paul Revere depicted it. And in fact, John Adams was the attorney for the British soldiers who were accused of murder. And he got all of them off basically because they were provoked and attacked by the group of patriots, we call them now, even though they were rebels back then. So it didn't happen that way. But the other interesting thing is that Paul Revere got the time wrong on the clock. It was not the time of the Boston Massacre. He had it off by 2 hours. So it was actually two early versions of this print. The first one with the time wrong, and the second one a couple of weeks later, where he corrected the time in the dial. A few other people did it as well, but here's a close-up. So you see that diamond-shaped dial. And also this was a twofer, because on the front of the old State House was a building-mounted sundial. And it was sundials that really enabled us to know really what time it was and to correct and adjust our ticking clocks, because we had no GPS, no radio, nothing else that was a time standard except the sun that was passing overhead. So there were many sundials around, including building mounted ones, like you see here. And often too, they were in gardens and even in people's pockets. But this is their Beauport. I'm sure many, if not all of you, have been to the lovely historic house of Beauport. And this is the sundial. You can see, when the sun is shining, the gnomon casts a pretty sharp shadows. You can be pretty closely attuned to what time it was and then adjust your clock. This is also, as you see, this is a Salem sundial. This was owned by Governor John Endicott, our first colonial governor here. And the thing with sundials is they have to be made and calibrated for your latitude. So this shows the latitude here and also shows that it was made for Salem, because if you use this in another place with a different latitude, it is not read correctly. But it's great to have this. This is in the PBS Museum collection. And if you have the alarm code and the key, I'd like to go in and take this one. So I'll talk to you afterwards if you have that. The thing with sundials, however, is that the sun is not accurate. The sun varies. Only 4 times a year is it clock time. The rest of the year can vary by up to 18 minutes. So you need an equation, a timetable, which tells you each day of the year whether you add or subtract time from the sundial to adjust your clock. And these were commonly used in these equation of time thing might be inside your grandfather clock, might be a little piece of paper. This one, as in many of them, was in an almanac, and this was in Franklin's Poor Richard's almanac for that particular year. And everybody would be consulting this if they were trying to set their clocks and watches based on their sundial. So there's a nice picture of Ben Franklin. This is by David Martin, 1767. And the reason I'm showing this is because Franklin designed our first colonial currency. You see, this is 1776. This was a Fugio dollar, they're sometimes called, because this is basically saying time flies. But he has the iconography, the imagery of a sundial here with the sun shining down on it. And the sundial was also kind of an image of work and how we should work. And that's why he says, mind your business. He's not saying mind your own business. He's not saying don't be nosy. He's saying get to work, do your business, because we have a country to build. We have a war to win against Britain. So everybody needs to buckle down. And when the sun's shining on that sundial, we should be out there doing something productive. So, that imagery of clocks sort of representing discipline and hard work and all certainly was in use in this case here too. And as I mentioned, almanacs, a lot of people used almanacs for calendar indications. And also, as you see, they would know when the eclipses were each year. And this is sort of timely since we just had a rare full lunar eclipse just a night or two ago. So this would tell you that too. So this would have had an equation of time chart in it and told you many other things about the calendar and what happened on various days during the year. This is not me. This is Galileo, who's been told I look exactly like. But I mentioned him because when he was sitting in the cathedral at Pisa, and you see I'm not lying, there's the tower. He was perhaps bored by the sermon, and he was watching a lantern swing from a chain or a rope inside, and he noticed that as it swung back and forth, no matter how widely back and forth it swung because of drafts or something, it was always coming back and forth at the same rate, and he was timing it with his pulse. So he realized that this could be applied to timekeeping, and he was the first to suggest that a pendulum on a clock could make it much more accurate. And he never lived long enough to create one based on his design. But it later was made. His son worked on it too, and he had the concept of assigning a pendulum to a clock, which then in the mid 1600s by a Dutch guy began to apply the clocks, and they became 100 times more accurate, because like the one we saw in the Salisbury Cathedral, maybe within 15-30 minutes a day accuracy, just because the way it was ticking wasn't very accurate. But once you apply a pendulum, you can get much more accurate. And that's what you see inside, all the grandfather clocks around, the nice one that's standing out in the hall there, all have this pendulum. And if the pendulum is about 3 feet long, it's called a royal pendulum, and its period of going back and forth is once a second. Every tick is exactly a second. because the shorter the pendulum, the faster it goes. If the longer it is, the slower it goes. So if one is about 3 feet long, every time it goes back and forth, it's a second each time. So it makes it very convenient to put a second hand on the base of the clock because you don't have to put any extra gears in there to make it read seconds. So in addition to town clocks, which were in Salem and Andover, where it was up there, people could start, knowing when to meet each other, when the church was starting, if the bells were ringing like crazy, the town was on fire, or the Native Americans were coming over the hill. But normally it was just announcing the time, and the bell could certainly be heard much farther away than the face of the clock could be read. So it's important to have a bell up in that tower as well. But also, people started to have clocks in their homes as well. And that was a sign of sophistication, of affluence. If you were rich enough to have a tall clock in your house, then it showed. And if there was a painting of the family like this one, and there was a clock in it, right away people could read the painting and know that this was a family that had a certain level of affluence and sophistication. This is a painting that's at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It's by Robert Peckham, the early 1800s, 1817. And it's actually a painting of his family in Bolton, Massachusetts, not too far from here. But this is one of those paintings that's actually a posthumous painting because little Elizabeth here had died about 3 months before the painting was done. And it wasn't unusual for paintings to be made that included dead people in them to show that they were still part of the family, they were being remembered, and they were still involved in the family, even if their physical presence was no longer there. So again, little Elizabeth had died, and that's why this is not a particularly joyful looking scene, even though it's sort of a party. But people don't look very happy. They're still mourning the little girl's death. This is also a familiar scene, perhaps not joyful as well. This obviously is a painting of a Salem witch examination. And you see that there's a clock in there as well. I guess again, sort of indicate that, it was a serious thing in some ways where there's a clock in the room, which was kind of governing things. I mean, look more closely at the clock. And it's an interesting design, and I could only find one other in one of our reference books that actually has a sort of top and a round dial as opposed to a square or a rectangular dial with an arch in the top. So it's interesting that kind of clock appeared, and they find this one example of an English maker that sort of had that same kind of top and a round dial. But and it was interesting, and sometimes you don't know if that was a real clock that the artist knew of and sort of copied, or whether they were just using a little poetic license because or artistic license, because it was not a typical form of a clock. And I kind of danced around what I call those floor standing clocks. Okay, sometimes you don't know if that was real clocks that the artists knew of. Oh, it sounds like who's playing in and go out there?
No, go ahead.
All right, thank you.
I'm not sure what happened there.
All right, well, no, that's fine. I just didn't want to be arguing with myself. That's like, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. So I before I interrupted myself, I was saying how nobody called those clocks grandfather clocks until this song came along around the time of the 1876 centennial called Grandfather's Clock. Some of you may remember this when the old man died. The clock stopped, never to run again. But before that, they were called just the clock, or perhaps an 8-day clock, meaning it was a standing clock that you only had to wind once a week instead of another kind of clock that needed daily winding, or maybe floor clock, a hall clock. But after that, then they started to be called grandfather clocks, and obviously that's what people have called them ever since. One of the principal makers of grandfather clocks in New England was Simon Willard. He also invented the banjo clock. There's one on the wall there too, which I'd like to see. So, and this was an innovation because before that, you either had the big standing grandfather clocks, or you had also quite expensive, smaller bracket clocks, mantle clocks, that most people could not afford either. So the banjo clock was a way to make an 8-day, a weekly winding clock that was smaller and more affordable. And Simon Willard was the inventor of that. He patented it. Everybody copied it immediately, so his patent well enforced, but there's a lot of banjo clocks with them. And this isn't a talk for gearheads, so I'm not going to talk all about how clocks work, but you might want to see the nice little machine that's inside of the banjo clock. And this is what the parts look like. So it looks like it's fairly simple. It's not that many parts, but you still have to make a wheel like this. And if this wheel has 48 teeth and you make it with 46 teeth, then you have something that ticks but doesn't tell time. So there's specific things that have to be done correctly in order for this to not just be a ticking machine, but actually tell time. The Willard family, again, was probably the most famous family of clockmakers in New England, if not the country. And this is the Willard House and Clock Museum. It's in Grafton, Mass, which I encourage you all to go to. It's full, it has the largest collection of Willard clocks anywhere in the world, more than 60 of them, I think. And a great place to visit. It's right out by the Tufts veterinary school as well, beautiful part of the country to go look at. This serious looking guy is Eli Terry, because he was really the guy that started the American Industrial Revolution and mass production techniques. He was commissioned to make 4,000 grandfather clock movements in 3 years. And before that, clockmakers could make 5-10 clocks a year if they were lucky. But he had the idea of harnessing water power and creating machinery that would very quickly make all the parts and make them interchangeable. And that really was the beginning again of the whole industrial revolution in America. And this was all in Connecticut, and all those machine shops and people that were creating clocks started to create other things. A lot of the firearms enthusiasts claimed it was Eli Whitney who began interchangeable parts in America. But his pistols that he kept getting additional subsidies and more contracts from the federal government because he claimed he was mass producing them. His pistols were never really interchangeable or mass produced until long after Eli Terry was producing clocks in his Ireland factory, which was part of Plymouth Center in Connecticut, where he was producing clocks by the tens of thousands. And one of the earliest designs was this clock called the pillar and scroll clock, which had weights that descended inside and had an outlet made almost entirely of wood. Because the brass was expensive. The British didn't want us making brass here. They made it expensive. And we looked around and we said, what have we got a ton of here? Which was wood. So they could make influence. They didn't travel very well on the ocean. They were selling them domestically. They made tens of thousands of them. They were affordable and expensive. And you see, again, most of the parts are wood, except the escape wheel up there. But that's very fine teeth, which you could really make out of wood. And they figured out which woods to use. Cherry was a good wood. Oak was good. Laurel wood for some of the shafts. And they made them well. And these were also like peddlers. You can see a clock in the back there. So the peddler would go house to house, town to town with his load of clocks. And a typical way he would work is that he would leave the clock kind of on approval on the mantle in some farmhouse. And, of course, particularly the farm wife was very excited about having this modern device on the mantle that made her look sophisticated and make the house look nice. And they hear the bell ring every hour. So when the clockmaker came back in a few months to say, do you want the clock or not? There was no way that clock was leaving the house. So it was a very successful sales technique, and that's why almost every house in New England ended up with one of these clocks eventually. Again, wooden movement clocks had the problems. In the late 1830s, there was a very serious economic downturn. Most of the wooden movement clock businesses went out of business, but then a guy named Chauncey Jerome, he claims in a dream, thought how to make an inexpensive brass clock. This is an OG case, it's called because of the shape of the movement. And inside was an inexpensive, but much more reliable, but also mass-produced brass clock. And they always had these openings in the dial, so your neighbors would know that you didn't have one of those old crappy wooden clocks. You had a brass movement in your clock, and you could actually see it ticking inside. So these became popular again. There's tens of thousands of these left. You can buy them 5 at a time at auction for $100 still, even though they're very old. So it's that once we figured out how to make main springs too, which was important because these were weight-driven clocks, and making a spring that didn't explode or break or kept its tension was tricky. But once in the 1840s and 50s, we figured out how to make those inexpensively. Then we could make even smaller clocks like this sharp Gothic. Some of you may have already said, "Oh, that's a steeple clock." But it's the same thing. They weren't called steeple clocks until much later. They were called the sharp Gothics. And one of my favorite horology and art images is this steeple clock or sharp Gothic. This game is also at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It's a great folk art painting. And this, you can see the artist had a little problem with perceptions. Is that perspective, I guess I should say here, because I don't think that kid was really that big. That's wrong. But anyway, I love it for many reasons, including the fact that there's a steeple clock on the wall behind it too. These became even more popular. They're, for obvious reasons, called black mantle clocks. They were imitating French marble clocks, which were about 10 times more expensive, but looked a lot like this. So by the end of the 1800s, every home that didn't already have a clock started to have black mantle clocks like this. And we see that they became important parts of the family to the extent where we see where this woman and her 2 kids are fleeing the Great Fire of Salem in 1914. This is a photo from that time, and you see that she's rescued the clock, maybe a few other things. She's got 2 kids. I assume she didn't have a 3rd kid. She left behind to make a clock instead. But anyway, and if you don't remember or believe how bad the fire of 1914 was, this is Salem after that fire. So I'm not sure where the Athenaeum was. Maybe somebody here knows whether it burnt down too, or if this building, I think this building precedes it, right? So, yeah, so the fire didn't get up this far, but obviously there were a lot of things that burnt up, and probably some of those black mantle clocks that weren't saved on the way up. But that's kind of a scary picture, probably for anybody here. You probably remember that fire, Bill, right? So, yeah, you were just a boy. Oh, yeah, okay, good. That's good. Another place where we talked about shipboard time telling, and that became important when you were crossing the ocean if you're trying to determine your latitude and longitude. So this, again, another Winslow Homer. I seem to be stuck on Homer. But this is a wonderful one called 8 Bells that's at the Addison Gallery of Art in hometown in Andover. So this is showing you taking the noon sighting and then also coordinating it with the timekeeping to determine their longitude, because that was very difficult to determine. You needed an accurate timekeeper. If you were just, taking a steamboat between Massachusetts and Rhode Island, you were in sight of land, and it wasn't that important to know where you were, because you could use landmarks that you could see from the ship in order to get there. But if you were out of sight of land, a lot of times you ended up in a bad situation, because you could be tens or hundreds of miles off if you weren't able to determine where you were. So this is a book which probably a lot of you have read. I hope it's in the library here. Tells the story of how John Harrison in England in the 18th century proved that accurate enough timekeeping could be developed on shipboard, and that you could then use it to determine your longitude within 5 or 10 miles of where you were, which meant that if you headed to Boston Harbor, you weren't going to end up in Richmond. So it was an important development. And eventually, when Harrison devised, turned into marine chronometers, which these were made and these were carried by the early 1800s. Most ships had them. This is an interesting one because it was made in Boston by William Bond. Mostly they were made in England and France, but this is a good one. They had to be accurate within seconds a month, or they were useless. They didn't have to keep perfect time. They just had to be perfectly inaccurate. So they were rated before they went out on the shipboard. You get a whole chart that said this chronometer loses 14 seconds a month. And then when the captain was determining his position, he would factor that into his mathematics to determine his longitude. So again, they didn't keep perfect time, but they kept perfect, imperfect time. And that was all they needed to do. This is another marine chronometer that looks a little worse for wear. You see, it was made in Liverpool, and that's because this chronometer was on this boat. So, and so, as you know, some things, the wreck was discovered, some things were retrieved from the wreck, including that chronometer there, which obviously chronometers didn't have iceberg warnings built into them. All you knew was what time it was and what time your ship went down, because that's what time the clock stopped at. And that was a different story. Another place where timekeeping became important in America was during the Civil War. It was kind of the first time that average soldiers could afford watches. This is a great early photograph of a regular soldier, and he's proudly displaying his watch. Almost certainly it was a Waltham made right down the road, the American Watch Company. This was the first company that began using the same mass production techniques that Eli Terry had done earlier with clocks, but of course on a much smaller scale. But before that, watches, they were handmade. They were handmade by specialists who would make only one part and somebody would put it together. But they often actually developed machinery that could produce these parts perfectly in great numbers and made reliable, affordable watches happen at that time. And there's an early view of the Waltham factory. The building still exists. It's bigger. It's no longer a factory. It has offices and condos, but there's a nice little museum on the first floor you can visit that tells the story of the Waltham factory. And there's a view of inside in 1893, and you see that most of the employees here are women. It was one of the best jobs in America that women could have, because they, for the same jobs, they were paid equally with the men, and they were doing very skilled work too. You see, of course, the supervisor is a man over there doing nothing while they're all working. But this is a kind of a view of the way the factory needed to be, with a lot of light. Narrow areas, and these women would sit at the benches, and mostly in this case probably assembling, because the machinery was somewhere else in the building cranking out all these parts, and a lot of that machinery was run by men, but the women were doing this type of work. And they were producing watches like this. This is called the railroad grade watch, or railroad watch, and that story was important too, because as railroads became more and more active, you needed accurate timekeeping, not just for the scheduling, but to keep them running smoothly. You see at the beginning, the Fall River line, between maybe one was leaving at 7 and 3, so they didn't have to worry about trains passing, and these were single track lines. So if they were coming in opposite directions, one had to get off on a siding so the other train could pass. As things started to get a little busier here, the Boston and Maine, see there's more trains going back and forth. Maybe the timing needed to be a little bit more. This is still 1846, but occasionally somebody's watch didn't work, and you ended up with a lot of expensive scrap metal on the track. And they really didn't like that happening. So they developed standards for very high grade, high accuracy pocket watches that were inspected regularly, had to be serviced regularly, and very strict characteristics for their accuracy, so that these kinds of wrecks would not happen. At railroad stations and other public buildings like this, there would be these regulator clocks. This was a Seth Thomas extra #1 from the 1880s. And I bought this clock from under a guy's bed here in Salem. And the fun thing, which I didn't really allow me to do, and that is kind of fun thing on top, but I discovered that the Young Men's Union was a Catholic fraternal organization in Salem, Massachusetts. What the lady friends did, I don't know. Maybe some people tell me, but they obviously liked the guys enough to buy them a clock for their clubhouse. And there's the Young Men's Union. So I have this hanging in my house now. It really should be back in Salem somewhere eventually. I don't think the Young Men's Union exists anymore, but I did find a little card recently on eBay from the Young Men's Union. You see their announcement that they're having a literary exercise at their building on this Monday night. The fun thing too is that it's assigned by George M. Whipple, who you may recognize as a famous name in Salem. This is a picture of George M. Whipple a little bit earlier when he was in the Civil War. And railroads were running on local time until standard time came about in the 1880s, which meant that scheduling was a nightmare because every town had its own noon and had its own local time. When the sun was overhead at noon, that was the time in Salem. And if you went from Salem to Worcester or Salem to Albany, the time was different by many, many minutes. And the railroad schedules were, the size of the Manhattan phone book because they were just, everybody ran on their same schedule. And you had to have clocks like this, which would show local time and railroad time. It was all very confusing until 1883, when we had the day of two noons, where finally standard time zones were established in America. 4 time zones going across. A lot of people were mad about this. They said, by God, Salem, my God, put the noon, put the sun straight above in Salem. We don't care what the railroad people say. But obviously it made a lot of sense to have people at least in a time zone on the same schedule so they weren't crashing trains and missing their trains as they did that. So we could look at a little more closely at Salem, and we always think, gee, I wonder whether that many watchmakers and clockmakers in Salem. This is a partial list going up to about 1850. I didn't show you the next page, but there were a lot of people, and it's because everybody had clocks and watches, and everybody's clocks and watches broke a lot or stopped working a lot because it was dirty. We didn't have paved streets, all that dust was rising. We had smoky fireplaces. We had people, dropping their watches all the time. They needed to be cleaned every year or 2 or 3, and you needed a lot of watchmakers and clockmakers to do that work. So some of the local makers, Samuel Mulligan has a great tall clock by Samuel Mulligan. I'm in the process of working on a book about all of the Mulligan family of clockmakers. They are a very important family in New England, mostly Massachusetts clockmakers. But there's a Samuel Mulligan. That's the movement that's in a Samuel Mulligan clock. You see, it's kind of like a bigger version of the banjo clock movement I showed you before. There are the parts of that, more parts, because this is a striking clock. The banjo clock only tells time. There's no longing on the hour. This has 2 machines, really. One of them does the striking of the bell, the other does the ticking. So there's a lot of parts there, and I actually know what each part does and how to put them back together again. So that took 10 years of training, but now I know which goes where. Samuel Mulligan also made these dwarf clocks like this, sometimes called grandmother clocks too. This one's just right down the street at the PPD Essex Museum, and this one is also by Samuel Mulligan, made in Salem. So it's a big clock here. At some point, I hope they'll find another second hand to put in there. It's not a sad thing. Just let it sit there with a part missing on the face. But I don't live here, so I guess they can do what they want with that. Here's an ad by Samuel Mulligan when he was in Salem, and you see that he's doing a lot of you see these right here on Reverend Prince's meeting house there too. So these guys were making many clocks because they still were expensive. You could still buy cheap ones too. So if you wanted a big tall clock, they were expensive. And mostly he was repairing clocks and watches too. So that was the basis of most of his billing. But you see, he's also he's selling other clocks, and he's also hoping to barter stuff for clocks too. There was a Joseph Mulligan too, a relative of his that was also in Salem. And you see that he's also advertising in 1793 for things that he's selling and repairing, and also warranted jacks. These aren't the things you bounce the ball and play with. These were roasting jacks, which were used to turn the meat in front of the fire. So you see one here mounted on the wall above the fireplace. So if you weight driven, the weight would descend. This would turn, it would come down here and it would rotate to spit. Because otherwise that was a horrible job for the wife or the son or servant to have to be there getting their eyebrows burnt off, while they're trying to turn their chicken so it doesn't get black on one side and raw on the other. So these were great machines. They were expensive, so not everybody had them, but that's what Joseph Mulligan was talking about selling. Another famous maker here is Edmund Currier. A great clock of his is also at the PPD Essex Museum. You see the beautifully decorated face of that one. It's an Edmund Currier lyre banjo clock, Lyre, and sort of in the shape of the musical instrument. So that's also hanging at the PPD Essex Museum. And in Beauport, which I mentioned earlier with the sundial, there's also a Courier on Wire Management Club in Beauport as well. And there's a close-up of the glass showing that it was made when Courier and Foster were teamed up in Salem, making beautiful clocks in addition to servicing people's clocks as well. And here's another one that was sold at auction, also by Courier and Foster, another wire band clock. And you see that these are not inexpensive. So if you see one at a yard sale for $10 or $15, maybe you should grab it while you can. And explain later. So there's some of these around. This is a wooden front banjo, which are less common, but some people prefer them. Some of those painted ones are a little too gold and flashy, so these are a little more understated. This was sold in Scanner, and you see this was the label that we made inside. It's nice when these labels are still there. Sometimes, of course, they fall off or dry up and are gone. But when they're still in there, you get a lot of good information in addition to who made the clock. And you see it's Derby Square. Is there still a Derby Square here? Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know what's at number 11 now, but Courier used to be there. And this is a great thing that I found recently too, because see, Edmund Courier, a lot of his papers are up at the New Hampshire Historical Society in Concord. And they have this certificate of Edmund Courier being a member of the Salem Charitable Mechanics Association. These are organizations that were designed to foster the education of young people who wanted to go into the trades, so that they would have night school. They would set up apprenticeships to help people get into the trades, which were important for every city and town, to make sure they had an adequate supply of people that could fix things and make things. This is a great thing. The other thing that I found here too in the small print was this was designed by a famous artist in Boston called John Rito Kennedy, who also painted clock dials and clock glasses. But it was worth looking at the fine print there because I saw that was a pen in the day. And Courier, of course, died like everybody did back then. And he, you see that the remnant of his stock is being sold at auction, and you see the kinds of things that he still had left over, including a lot of these tools, which were necessary for the production of clocks and watches. I'm sorry I missed that auction. I would have liked the very low prices promised like that. So you saw this on the title page. This is a watch paper. So this would put inside the lid of the watch, so that one of the covers. So this would serve to help keep dust out. So that function, but it also showed who either serviced the clock or sold the clock. And sometimes there's stacks of them inside, so you can peel away one and see one underneath. So it's great if you buy or find a little pocket watch and find a watch paper inside. It's exciting to see that, and they're usually nicely engraved prints that are interesting to see. So here's another clockmaker from repairer, I guess, from the time in Washington Square. I found this in a clock that I was servicing, Charles Lamson, and of course we know Daniel Lowe. This is one of his catalogs from a while ago. Of course, this sign in the building is still there where he was located. I've serviced many clocks and watches that have his name on the dial. He wasn't making them there. He was retailing them there. This is an example of one Daniel Lowe and Company pocket watch made by Waltham that if you ordered enough of them, if you were a jewelry store, you could get your name on the dial too, and often on the movement as well. We're almost at the end, but this is a great thing. I can't find anything more about W.K. Hawes, but this is a half of a stereo view from Salem. So I think this guy was here, and there were crazy guys periodically who would make these monumental clocks, that did everything. They would spend, every night for 40 years, making something that, the planets turned and figures popped in and out, the music played and everything. So, and this one doesn't exist anymore. A few of them are still left, after they went to Barnes and people found them before the mice ate them all. But this is a great image, and someday I hope to find out more about Mr. Boggs, and maybe if this is in somebody's garage down the street, you should let us know, because we'd be happy to learn more about it too. One of my other talks, and you've probably seen some of the examples already, is horology and art. I look for fine art paintings going back to the beginning of ticking time, the 1300s, and I have more than 2,000 art images now of fine art images with clocks that have, Rembrandt, all the way from Rembrandt to Jamie Wyeth. And my symposium at the MFA in 2017 was on that subject. I had speakers from all around the world who came and spoke about art with clocks and watches in them. And these aren't selfies or snapshots. The clocks and watches were in there for a reason. They were to show again that the person was sophisticated or disciplined, or once in a while what time it was, but that really wasn't that important, as Paul Revere discovered with his great print of the Boston Massacre. But they were in there, and again, I'd be happy to return at some point and show you a lot of eye candy of fine art that has them in it too. So one of the ones I usually conclude with is that this is a painting by Jerome Thompson. It was painted in 1858. And this is at the top of Mount Mansfield, which is the tallest mountain in Vermont. And you see this climbing party, it's up and up there, but you see it's starting to get a little bit late. So there's a detail of that painting. And this guy is holding up his pocket watch and saying, by the way, I don't know if you want to go down the mountain in the dark. So maybe we should get going now. And that's my cue to get going as well. And I appreciate your listening. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll talk a few minutes about what's on the table. I see two folks have brought clocks here too. What I also brought, let me know if you can still hear me. This is actually an example of probably the late 1700s grandfather clock movement, like what's out in the hall there and what I showed you before. And this is an example of one of those wooden movements. This came out of Connecticut clock from the 1820s, probably. You see that these are all years, and this, if this were hooked up to a weight, this would tick and work still to this day. So there's still tens of thousands of these left in the world. Because they were well made and people wanted to keep them. Sometimes a year or two breaks, it's wood, and then I do my dental work, where I replace the tooth with a little piece of wood. But they're kind of incredibly amazing that they last that long. So I'm happy to see trouble that came along. This I peeked in before because the face of the clock has the retailer name on it. Let's see which I should. Yeah, this is Street Front Law. So I know a lot of you know that jewelry store in Boston. I used to service clocks for them. In fact, when I first started out, so they didn't make anything. They were like Tiffany, where they would label good things and sell them in the store. On the movement of this clock, it says Ansonia Clock Company, because they were the maker of this style of clock. This essentially is like a bracket clock. They were called that because originally there was a little shelf for the bracket that they would stand on. So you put the bracket on the wall, and this clock would sit on top of it. But mostly after a while, they would use it on tables or mantles. And this was a Westminster chime clock. Anything that has 3 winding bolts means that there's 3 machines inside, one for ticking, one for striking the hours, and the third one for doing the Westminster chiming under quarter hours. So there's 3 main springs, 3 sets of gears that are all working in tandem inside, and you have little dials here that can adjust the timekeeping rate, the slow, fast, and also turn the chiming on and off too. This typically gets worn because this is a silver dial, but the silvering is pretty thin. You can't scrape it off and pay for your kids' education. But you often see it's worn out in certain places where somebody maybe has been hitting it when they're winding the clock or setting it too. So some of the silvering has come off. And if we make this an official kind of road show thing, well, what's this worth? Am I gonna fade when I hear this? No one's gonna fade with this. These are pretty common. And at auction this might sell for a couple $100. Because even though it's old, it's probably 110 years old, maybe. They made a lot of them, and of course, the value is determined by who wants to buy it and pay for it. And there aren't that many people who live in clocks like this. Yes.
For a clock like that being be oiled,
If you don't want it to work, you just keep oiling it. But if you want it to work reliably, somebody like me needs to periodically take it apart and deal with the dirt and the wear that's built up. Because the problem with continuing to oil a dirty clock is that you essentially you oil the dirt and dirt is an abrasive. So you, it starts, maybe it stopped because it dried up. So you said, well, let me just spray some WD in there or put oil in there. So all that grit, you've now combined with oil again, and that grit starts to chew out the metal parts. So you can get away with it briefly, but just oil clocks is not good. It's like if you change the oil on your car and you don't change the filter, it's kind of the same thing. But, nobody knows this unless they know it. And these clocks, were so robust that they would run for decades without service. And then suddenly the thing would stop and they'd come to me, oh man, what's going on? This clock's been taking grit for 50 years. But well, try running your car for 50 years without changing the oil. Eventually it's going to quit. It's a machine. There's nothing magic about it, but they take it personally like, they did something wrong. The best one usually is it's the husband that breaks it. That's worked great until that guy, wow, that doesn't work since. But they're machines and they need periodic service the same way any other machine is. But the fact is, it's sort of a miracle that they work at all. I mean, name any other machine anywhere that's going 24/7 after 110 years. There's nothing else in your house. And if you tell me somebody in the year 21, 22 is going to be using your vacuum cleaner, your dishwasher, I don't think so. So, it's sort of amazing. I mean, let alone 200 years. I mean, that wooden movement is 200 years old and it would still work. So, again, there's no reason to be mad at the clock when it quits after 40 years. You just, realize that you need to get the service. This one I didn't look at before I got here, but it's another tree crumping logo. Similar to they're sometimes called Lancet style cases because they come up to a little point here. But I think I know what I'm going to see in the back here. I think this, I thought it was going to be a French movement, but this is also an American movement, but more designed to look like a French movement and like a French clock. But this is nice with some extra inlaying too. But of course, all of you now know that since it only has 2 winding holes, it's just time to strike. There's no quarter-hour music that comes out of it. So this would just probably a single every half hour to let you know another half hour your life has gone by. And then it would count the hours to when it gets to that point. So again, this. They were nice clocks. They were relatively expensive when they were new, but not particularly desirable or collectible now. So they still, again, it might be only a few hundred. When I was in the clock selling business, Bill kindly told I was sold 1,800 clocks and watches. I might have this one at an antique show. I might have $500 or $600 on it. But it would be because I've added the value of servicing the clock and guaranteeing that it runs. So that, if you just buy it at auction, for $200, then you're looking at another $300 or $400 to make it work. And it doesn't when you get it home. So that was the story there. So I've also brought a couple of the reference books that I use to enable the watches. There's big books like this. So if you came to me with a Waltham pocket watch, I could tell you from the serial number when it was made and its approximate value too. There's books like this which actually reproduce and drop parts out of them, reproduce original factory catalogs. So almost every American clock that's brought to me for repair, I can open up a book like this and show them the clock from how it was originally advertised and what it cost back in whatever the year was. So it's great when someone brings me a clock, especially some ornate thing. Let's see if I can quickly find one. Some like carved wooden thing. Let's see, they're sometimes called gingerbread clocks, sometimes you can't see that well, but these look fancy and everything. But once in a while, someone will come to me and bring me a clock and say, my grandfather made this clock. It's all hand carved, you know, it was beautifully made. And I said, well, he must have made about 50,000 of it. I can show you this clock in a catalog. So, I mean, it's fun. I think eventually they understand that it has value even if grandpa didn't spend a year carving it and himself. So, and then, I this book too, and this is where I got that partial list of the Salem clock makers. It's just had just tens of thousands of American clock and watchmakers in here. So mostly if someone brings me an American clock that isn't one of the big factory produced ones, I can still find a name in here. I certainly find Courier in here. I find Daniel Lowe in here. And if somebody clock guys tend to be a little obsessive sometimes, you know, so some people actually went to the trouble of finding all these guys and creating a book to make it easier for the next guys to find clock makers. So that's one thing I like about horology is that a lot of people put a lot of research time into producing things like this, so you can know a lot about it. And often the makers weren't shy about putting the name on it either. You know, you buy a piece of sandwich glass, you know, good luck knowing who made it, when, if it's right or not, because, you know, it doesn't say in big letters across the name. You know, Ebenezer Finch, you know, made it, like it would have on a clock. So it's also fun for me in those reasons because pretty often you can quickly identify who made it and then go to these resource books and learn a whole lot about it afterwards too. So this is one of the 800 plus books on clocks and watches that Bill was kind enough to mention. I never met a clock book I really like, and they seem to like me too because I have long. So I'm done, but I can certainly answer questions either from the floor or privately later. The only thing I ask, usually by the time I'm done talking, all the cookies are gone. So at least one cookie for me, right? Right, yes,
That's going to show and tell. I was a little pocket watch.
Yeah.
I was cleaning out my father's apartment. And found this and it doesn't work. And I brought it out to watch shop in Cambridge. They said this will cost you so it has to be fixed. But I guess my question is there a history of pocket watches as interesting as what we've heard from these, or are they just too recent? No, I imagine that these were very popular when my grandfather's father was around. So
Yeah.
you're saying that they could sort of things.
sure. Yeah, I think I'm more of a clock guy than a watch guy, but I certainly know a ton about watches too, and I could give a talk of the same weight about this too, because there's a lot going on in a watch that's different than in a clock, and there's the whole culture of it too, where you know, who owned them and why, and the progression they made, especially from being handmade in England, mostly in France, to being mass produced in America and Switzerland. The fun thing too is that when Waltham started manufacturing watches in bulk, the choices people had were either expensive pocket watches from England or really crappy pocket watches from Switzerland. And everybody said, oh, Swiss watch, you know, it's like a Swiss watch, you know, I have a Rolex, oh, you know, great, you know, Swiss watch. Most Swiss watches were junk at the time that Waltham started out. For every 3 that they shipped to America, 2 never worked. And the third one, you know, no watchmaker could fix when it broke because, you know, they just were low quality. I mean, they were good Swiss watches too, but the bulk of them, they were mass produced there, you know, in a piecework kind of system again. So, and then people had pocket watches then, you know, in the roaring 20s and all, they wanted to be thinner and more stuff. So there were thinner ones, but then it was really World War I, where men became acceptable for men to wear wristwatches. And that led basically by the Depression to the end of pocket watches for men, because they started to wear wristwatches. Before that, wristwatches were bracelet watches and women wore them. But too many guys, you know, got killed when they were, you know, checking their pocket watch in the trenches. You know, they were deciding, you know, deciding to jump out of the trench. So they decided that maybe it was okay to wear a wristwatch. No one was going to, you know, think that you were effeminate by having a wristwatch, because at least you'd still be alive. But anyway, that was a too long answer to your question. But, okay, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on there too. those railroad watches are just beautiful. They have jewels in them, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard, oh, it's a 17 jewel watch. And that's not to make it pretty, it's not like they're in there so it'll sparkle and everyone will think you're wonderful. It's those jewels are in there as the bearings, the things that the shafts turn into, because the Swiss figured out in the 1700s that they could drill tiny holes in jewels like garnets or rubies, and that became the hole, the bearing that the gear would turn in. Because otherwise, gear essentially, you drill a hole in the brass, and that's the hole that the gear turns in. And after a while, that hole gets more and bigger because it gets chewed up. Because Uncle Wendy has sprayed the WD-40 with it, and instead of cleaning it, and that happens in watches too. So and watches stuff, is smaller and things are going faster, so they can chew themselves up pretty fast. But if you can get a jewel like a ruby that's 10 times harder than brass or steel, and you could drill a hole in it, it can turn in there. Way less friction, so you don't need as big a spring. It's not going to wear as fast. You don't need as much oil because it's so smooth inside that jewel. So, so the 17 jewel is sort of the standard for most of the bearings having jewels. But railroad watches to have 23 jewels, 25 jewels. Sometimes, I think this Rolex maybe has 27 or something because they jewel every place where things turn. Just to eliminate the wear and reduce the friction. So, there's a lot of stuff going on, and watchmakers and clockmakers were really like the smartest guys around, the ones that were making the things that were the most difficult to make. Because to make a little machine, in the 1700s, machine this big with gears in it that keeps time within even 10 minutes a day, there was nothing else comparable that they were making that was so sophisticated and so difficult to make and so obvious when you made it wrong. I guess, you made a sword and the first time the guy hits you with a sword broke in half, you maybe have an idea of him too, he wasn't any good. But, with watches, there's no baloney, it works or it doesn't. And it's an important story of, of sort of industrial revolution too. And, so many other trades and crafts grew out of watchmaking and clockmaking because they sort of showed how precision machining could be done to then make other things that were equally complex and equally important to society. Well, another long answer. Anybody want a short answer?
Well, it's actually kind of really by saying, watches are so popular, but now it's all digital.
Yeah.
So this is, kind of the end of the road for clocks.
Yeah. Well, I guess the pendulum is swinging, because there's still people that do it, and there's the steampunk people, that like clock stuff, and they take the gears and make a hat out of them. But some of them actually make them clocks. And encouraging to me, it's there still are big clock and watch auctions. There's one happening November 20th in New Hampshire, where there's probably 2,000 antique clocks for sale. All of them will be sold. Some of them will sell for thousands of dollars. So there's still collectors, but you're right, it's the wristwatches. Some Wall Street guys, that they have 10 Rolexes, they collect them and they meet and brag about the watches they have. Just within the last 2 days, I got 2 big thick watch collector magazines. What's the new, Patek Philippe, what's the new Audemars, they're great, they're beautiful, they're incredibly precise mechanical machines. So there's a lot of people that appreciate the fact that, on their wrist, they still have sort of a highly refined mechanical thing. You open up your iPhone, you just close it, and you don't know what's happening there. You can't see the electrons. But when you open up the watch, it's actually something turning, something moving, and you sort of can figure out how it's working in there. So I think there's still a fascination for mechanical things. I speak to school kids sometimes, and in a group of 10, there's maybe 2 that you give them a clock like this to look at, and they won't give it back. This is cool. The others are like, get me out of here. This guy's crazy. But but there are certain people that are just drawn to mechanical things. The smartest people, of course. That's still a duller, you can keep looking at their iPhones. So I think there's hope, and I see signs of increasing hope that some people, even under 80, still think these things are pretty cool. And it's almost like it's so old that it's new to people. Almost like 30 years ago, oh, that's grandma's old clock, that piece of junk. I never want to see that again. But like now the next generation is like, wow, I've never seen anything like that. Was that great grandma's? I want that. So, I think there's hope. You all are here, which I appreciate. So maybe that's hope too. I'm warning out. Anybody else? Are you ready? Spencer?
I was just wondering, is the grandfather clock control case clock, are they synonyms?
Yes.
They are.
Yes, but there's purists who say even tall case clock, that's like redundant because if it's a tall clock, it's a case clock. So the terminology is fuzzy, and there's people who, will complain if you don't call it by the right name. But I think the point of language is to let people know what you're talking about. So I think, no one's confused if you say tall case clock. But, I suppose if you work at winter, and that's a, conservator there, and you say grandfather clock, they hand you your pink slip. Maybe.
I got one story for you. I have a granddaughter, figure out the old truck. She just told me that there's a crank to roll the window down. It was amazing. This was great. All that you're like.
Actually, something happens and something else happens. Yeah, no, that's good too. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that father of mass production? His name was Eli something.
Eli Terry. Terry. Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, because he started out making, a few clocks at a time. But also still out of wood, because again, brass was expensive. So he was a clock maker of movements, but he got a contract with two cousins, the Porter. People thought they were brothers, but they weren't. Who were essentially investors, entrepreneurs, and those two Porter guys. There was the famous Porter contract in 1803, I think, whatever the year was, where they essentially commissioned him and they gave him the startup money to build his factory, where he made a lot of. They looked sort of crude as machinery, but essentially instead of one guy taking one gear at a time and cutting it out, they could arrange like a whole row of blanks on an axle and run the split saw down them, and and index it around, and cut the 30 teeth or whatever it was in that gear, and pull them off that shaft, and they were all identical. And then the women sitting at those benches could just put these clocks together, and every part would work with the other part. So he was the innovator. It's sort of a common story in American business, where the guy that worked for him, Seth Thomas, bought out Terry and ended up making like 50 times more money than the guy that invented it. But because he was more of a businessman, Seth Thomas was a case maker. He wasn't a clock maker to begin with, but he took that whole factory production system to next steps, and really, more and more mass production. But Terry did find good, he was rich, and he, was philanthropic and all that. So and he had offspring that were also in the business that did a lot of innovation. So, and he was an important guy. And again, this was all water power, so you needed to be by the stream. And in the winter, maybe when the stream froze, he found something else to do. But that Porter contract was just a pivotal moment in American industry, because it proved that factory production could work for producing machinery.
So this was in the early 1800s.
Yes, and in the Waterbury, Bristol area, there's a wonderful museum in Bristol called the American Clock and Watch Museum that has hundreds of clocks like this and watches, and also some of the machinery. There's actually one of the machines there that Terry produced. And there were templates too. So that was another important innovation, was that some of the parts aren't round. They have specific shapes, and if the shape is wrong, it doesn't work. So they were, templates. So that was unusual too. Instead of just sort of figuring out or copying the one you just made and hope it works. These were templates so they could stamp them or cut them quickly, and everyone would be perfect and would be the same. So that was another part of the innovation in the Connecticut Historical Society of Hartford. There's a lot of those blanks and templates from early Connecticut production too. In a drawer where you see that, they figured it out. And, before that, there were other people doing it by hand and, making 20, 50, 100 parts a day, by working dawn to dusk until the sun went down. But if you just throw the switch on the machine and it spits out 500 of them an hour, the thing's going to be cheaper and the parts are going to be better actually too.
Thank you, Bob. That was wonderful.
Certainly, anybody that's interested in any of these images, I know what they are. You can email me, I'll send them to you. This is a list of everything I did. So this is all public information for free. All right.
Yeah, join them in the back.
That's very good. If you want to talk to you.
See Carol, next.
So, yeah, check it out. So, maybe not.